Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. This presentation will cover the rationale for changes to the new guidelines, followed by a discussion of what's new per section. The 2020 guidelines were finalized in June 2020 and became effective and will become effective on the 1st of October this year. So South Africa has significant expertise in the design and conduct of clinical trials. At the same time, we have vulnerable populations from which our trial participants are recruited. It's therefore vital that all aspects of clinical trials take into account the South African context, and this is the point of SAGCP 2020. Department of Health Guidelines on Ethics in Health Research 2015 cover the ethical aspects and the infrastructure requirements for clinical research, while SAGCP 2020 covers practical issues related to study implementation. The two guidelines are meant to supplement each other. The 2020 guidelines, which contain updated information, are not only more user-friendly, but they take into account local realities and requirements. The guidelines align with international guidelines such as ICH-GCP, but were revised in collaboration with the Department of Health, NHREC, and SAPRA. In Section 1, in addition to the Department of Health guidelines, international guidelines that we need to be familiar with are listed and include WHO and ICH-GCP and Good Lab Practice guidelines. I want to draw your attention to the last guideline on the list, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry Guidelines, which are relevant for compensation of trial participants in the event of trial-related injury. And a statement along the lines of compensation for trial-related injury will be in accordance with ABPI guidelines may be found in the study informed consent document. South African GCP guidelines are not to be regarded as recommendations. Compliance is mandatory as per South African law, namely the National Health Act and the Medicines and Related Substances Act. If there is a conflict with respect to what is stated in international guidelines, SAGCP takes precedence and South African law takes precedence over SAGCP unless there is a clear GCP or ethical requirement stipulating otherwise. If there are doubts or queries, these should be raised with SAPRA or NHREC via RECs so that there is a standardized response. In Section 2, there are 9 key concepts. Of these, changes have been made in just 2 areas, namely trial incentives and reimbursement, and data management and results dissemination. These sections will be discussed in the next slide. The amount of reimbursement should not influence participants' consideration of risk. At the same time, participants must be allowed to make their own choices about participation. If a trial has been assessed as being ethical with a reasonable risk-benefit ratio, potential participants should be allowed to choose to participate or not. When it comes to reimbursement, there is no standard reimbursement amount, and participants should be reimbursed for their expenses related to time spent at the research site, the level of inconvenience that they're put through, and travel expenses as per the recommendations by NHREC guidelines of 2012. The TIE method advocated for in NHREC guidelines are based on current market-related hourly rates for unskilled labor. Moving on to the discussion around dissemination of trial results, it's the responsibility of both the sponsor and the site PI to disseminate results. Prior to implementation, the trial must be registered on a national clinical trials registry, and this is advocated by the World Health Organization. Dissemination of results must occur to all stakeholders, and this includes the Department of Health, SAPRA, research ethics committees, trial participants, and the communities from which these participants are drawn. and this dissemination of results must occur within 1 year of analysis being complete. The conditions for the publication of results must be included in the protocol, and this must be approved by research ethics committees and regulatory bodies. Section 3 addresses the recruitment of vulnerable participants. This section provides general guidance on when the recruitment of vulnerable populations is warranted. Specific guidance to recruitment of pregnant women, people with mental incapacities, and prisoners has been removed. Specific groups addressed include recruitment of children, adults with incapacity to provide informed consent, and persons-independent relationship. The anticipated impact of the proposed research on the health needs of the community must be clear so that the research is relevant. There's also an emphasis on the role of research ethics committees to ensure that research participants are not exploited or that their vulnerability is not increased. The informed consent form must stipulate measures to protect vulnerable study participants. Research ethics committees have the right to request interim reports of participant welfare and safety, and they can also request increased monitoring by the study sponsor. Section 4 introduces various regulatory authorities in the South African clinical research arena, and this includes SAPRA, the National Health Research Ethics Committees, in addition to the national and provincial research committees, which have the responsibility to ensure that relevant public health issues are prioritized for research at both the national and the local level. With respect to research ethics committee membership, it's required that committee members must be representative of various backgrounds and disciplines to provide appropriate review. In terms of training, research ethics committee members who review clinical trials must have ethics training in addition to GCP training, which must include SAGCP. And the renewal of GCP certification must occur every 3 years. There's also a section on document retention in the REC office. Documents must be retained by RECs for at least 3 years after the conclusion of a trial and must be available for regulatory review on request. So in section 5, we see definitions related to investigators, the various categories, as well as the role of the site investigator. The principal investigator must demonstrate committed time to study oversight. More and more boots on the ground PIs are becoming a sponsor requirement. The absent PI is no longer acceptable. The PI and the sub-Is must be clinicians registered with the Health Professionals Council of South Africa. The PI can delegate clinical decision-making to the sub-I, but the ultimate responsibility for trial conduct and patient safety is that of the principal investigator. Moving on to the definition of the co-PI. This can be a qualified non-clinician scientist, with a second co-PI being a Health Professionals Council registered clinician who will oversee patient management and safety. The sum of the roles must cover all that a site PI would be responsible for. The same rules apply to trials of traditional medication. The national PI is required where the protocol is being implemented at multiple South African sites, and the national PI is responsible for communicating on behalf of the sites with the sponsor, SAPRA, and the research ethics committees. As much as possible, the national PI should be involved as an investigator at one of the trial sites. Section 5 also reiterates the role of the investigator in ensuring that the study is implemented as per protocol, with targets for accrual, retention, and data quality being met in addition to participant safety and management of investigational product, including the disposal of investigational product. The informed consent document must take into account local context and requirements, especially for multi-center studies. For example, if it's applicable, include a piece on co-enrollment measures or reimbursement mechanisms. The information related to source document maintenance has been changed, and this has changed from 15 years to 10 years retention after final closure of the trial, or at least 2 years after formal discontinuation of the clinical development of the investigational product. The disposal or the disposition of investigational product at the end of the trial is not covered in detail by SAGCP. And in the 2020 SAGCP guidelines, it's covered quite well. They indicate that it must be stipulated in the protocol whether the IP will be returned to the sponsor or destroyed locally. The destruction process must be outlined in a site-specific SOP, and certificates of destruction must be filed appropriately and produced on request by regulatory authorities. There are also specific stipulations for electronic data handling and requirements for computer systems. And this has become the use of remote monitoring computer systems, collecting of electronic data has become more prevalent during the pandemic. Computer systems must be virus-proof. Access to these systems must be restricted. And if electronic case report forms are being used to collect data, all of the changes to these CRFs must be evident. There must be an audit trail. And then finally, progress reports to SAPRA must be submitted on a 6-monthly basis and to RECs annually. Now moving on to sponsor responsibilities. It's important to tease out and be aware of the difference in responsibilities of various role players in clinical trial design and implementation. The sponsor can be a pharmaceutical company, a funding organization, an organization designated by the funder research institute. The applicant is the individual or organization that acts on behalf of the sponsor at a local level. In a multi-site trial, it is the national PI who makes the joint SAPRA application in addition to REC applications. The sponsor may delegate some or the majority of their responsibilities to a clinical research organization, but it's important to bear in mind that the sponsor and the PI are ultimately responsible for the trial oversight, as the design, implementation and the dissemination of results is a collaborative effort between these two parties and only these two. What's new in the guidelines relates to indemnity of site investigators and disposal of trial-related waste. The sponsor is responsible for providing legal and financial cover for claims against site investigators for adverse events. This does not cover any claim that arises out of professional negligence or malpractice. Investigators are required to have personal malpractice insurance to cover negligence. Apart from the management and disposal of the investigational product, the sponsor is also responsible for disposal of study-related waste, example needles and syringes. And this process of disposal should be documented in a site-specific SOP. In terms of the clinical trial protocol and the writing up of that, the local PI must demonstrate that the protocol has been scrutinized to assess whether the protocol is relevant to the South African context, and a rationale for the study being implemented at all must be given. This must be addressed in both the Research Ethics Committee and the SAPRA application. Justification for conducting the study in South Africa must be made. This is not new in comparison to the 2006 guidelines, but the language has been changed to emphasize the importance of this being addressed adequately. The protocol must demonstrate the relevance to South Africans. How will the lives of South Africans be changed for the better with the implementation of this protocol? Measures to protect already vulnerable communities from which study participants will be recruited must be addressed. And there should be an explanation of how study procedures may differ from one site to another. For example, not conducting genital tissue biopsies among populations at high risk for HIV infection, or using a risk score to identify volunteers at low risk for HIV infection if biopsies are to be performed. For multi-center, multi-country studies, how have local ethical issues been addressed with respect to eligibility criteria and the informed consent process? Has this been considered at the point of study design and protocol development? Efforts to build local capacity and expertise must be evident. The protocol team must include South African researchers in various leadership roles. And this applies especially to those from previously disadvantaged backgrounds. Clear justification for exclusion of sites from the sponsor or the funder country or developed countries must be included if they are not to participate in the study. So requirements related to the investigator's brochure, that's section 8, and study essential documents section 9 remain unchanged in comparison to the 2006 guidelines. However, a new section has been added to address other relevant considerations. And the first of these other considerations revolves around conflict of interest, which can be motivated by scientific recognition or financial gain. Conflict of interest may be classified as direct or indirect and has the potential to impact the study design, the way the study is implemented, data analysis, and the reporting of results. Conflict of interest may impact participant safety if it influences who is recruited, the study procedures, safety assessments, and the reporting thereof. It may also impact the integrity of the research if it influences what data is collected or what data is not collected and what is and what is not reported on. So it's important to recognize that conflict of interest will arise, and it will not always be a bad thing as long as it is managed appropriately as per a clinical trial organization or a research ethics committee SOP. Details related to the identification, its disclosure, its management or elimination must be addressed in the relevant SOP. It's the responsibility of site staff, investigators to identify conflicts of interest and disclose them and handle them as per institutional policy. So moving on to clinical trial insurance, it's the responsibility of the sponsor to secure clinical trial insurance, but it's the responsibility of the REC or any other regulatory body to ensure that clinical trial insurance is in place. Participants or their families will qualify for compensation for any significant trial-related injury that results in death or is disabling. Claims related to pain, suffering, or loss of income are unlikely to be successful under South African law. The sponsor does not have to admit liability for the injury. It's important to note that the participant, in addition to claiming compensation from the sponsor, may pursue legal action for negligence on the part of the investigator, for example, inappropriate management of an adverse event. So that's why it's important for site investigators to have personal malpractice insurance. There are specific conditions under which a sponsor may not provide compensation of trial-related injury, and this includes any deviation from the protocol, specific procedures and any negligence on the part of either the investigator or the participant. So other considerations covered are reflected in the slide. Post-trial access is not really elaborated on in the 2020 guidelines. The reader is actually referred to SAPRA guidelines, which in short indicate that post-trial access is applicable to trials involving unregistered pharmaceutical products that may be found to be superior to the comparator in a clinical trial. The discussion about post-trial access with the participant must occur prior to enrollment during the informed consent process. Under assessing safety and risks, it's emphasized that the ICF and the informed consent process should clearly indicate to the participant the steps to be followed in the event of an adverse drug reaction. That is, the participant must know who to report to, when to report to, and what to report. In this section, they also cover the role of the Data Safety Monitoring Board, that is the DSMB, in ensuring the safety of participants. The DSMB is required to conduct periodic, scheduled, or ad hoc review in addition to making timely recommendations following interim analysis for either efficacy, futility, or safety. So moving on to human reproduction considerations, it's important to determine the impact of new efficacious interventions on pregnancy so that pregnant women may benefit from efficacious interventions. But at the same time, local and international guidelines for trial participation of individuals with reproductive potential must be adhered to. For example, contraceptive requirements must be stipulated. The paragraph on new technologies addresses genomic and genetic research and the relevance of the proposed research to local communities, in addition to protection of privacy and the impact of incidental findings on communities. This must be considered at the protocol drafting phase, and Joseph already addressed this during his presentation, and possibly there could be discussion during the discussion period of this session. With working remotely or having to sign documents for stakeholders in different geographical locations, the use of an electronic signature has become very commonplace. However, it's very important to note that an electronic signature is as legally binding as a handwritten signature and must comply with the Code of Federal Regulations. The electronic signature must be accompanied by a printed name of the signer, of the signatory, the date and time, and the meaning of the signature. Example, I have read and I approve this document, or I am the owner of this document, having drafted its content. So moving on to therapeutic misconception and dual roles. Having dual roles of the investigator and clinician can lead to confusion and sometimes even deception, which may not be intentional. The clinician researcher must act in the best interests of the patient when it comes to making a recommendation of enrolling as a trial participant, and potential participants must be made aware during consenting that there may be no direct benefit to them participating in the trial. So lastly, moving on to the section on conducting clinical trials during a pandemic. COVID-19 has impacted the way in which clinical trials are implemented, with modifications to operations becoming necessary. SAPRA and regulatory authorities need to be advised of measures taken to ensure participant safety and staff safety as well. At the same time, there must be GCP compliance and trial integrity. Changes to accrual targets and procedures must be reported to SAPRA and the Research Ethics Committee. So, this is my final slide. In summary, SAGCP addresses all aspects of clinical trial implementation, while the Department of Health guidelines address infrastructure and ethical issues. The guidelines are not meant to replace each other. They need to be used in conjunction as they supplement each other. Compliance is not mandatory. Compliance is mandatory. It's not just a recommendation. And if there is any doubt about what in interpreting the guidelines, NHREC or SAPRA can be consulted via the REC.